Have you ever had a conversation with someone whose first language isn't English, whether at the store, at work, on the phone, or maybe at school, and that conversation didn't go very smoothly? Maybe they didn't understand you. Maybe you got a little frustrated. But at some point, the thought crossed your mind, why can't they just learn English? The short answer is, it's not quite that simple. Learning a language is a complex process that involves a lot of effort over a long period of time. In fact, some will claim that English is the hardest language in the world to learn. And while that's not exactly true, in this video series we are going to explore what specifically makes English difficult to learn, and what are some practical things that we can do to help language learners along in their English learning journey. In this first video, we're going to briefly survey the history of English in order to see how it has become what it is today. Then, in the second video, we will build on this information and look at some specific difficulties that non-native speakers have with English. Finally, in the third video, we will discuss some practical solutions to help support English learners in the classroom or other contexts. First, let's talk about why English is the way that it is. So how did we get English? Every language in the world came from some primary language family at some point in the distant past. Some of them we know, and some of them we don't. But we do know that English came from a language family called Indo-European. The Indo-European languages originated probably somewhere north of the Black Sea in what is now parts of Russia and the Ukraine. About 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, the people who spoke this original language started to spread out into Iran, India, and Europe. That's why it's called the Indo-European language family. This means that most of the languages of Europe and many of the languages of Iran and India originally came from the same source. When these peoples settled in Europe, they formed smaller language families such as Slavic, Italic, Celtic, and the Germanic families. English actually comes from the Germanic family. The Germanic peoples settled in Northern Europe and broke into three language groups: East Germanic, North Germanic, and West Germanic. The East Germanic languages died out. The North Germanic languages, also known as Norse, eventually became the Scandinavian languages of Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, Icelandic, and a small language you've probably never heard before called Faroese. English, however, comes from the West Germanic group. Between the years 400 and 500 AD, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. This meant that the Romans left the island of Great Britain, which they had occupied for quite a while. When this happened, some West Germanic tribes started to migrate to the island. Among these tribes were the Frisians, the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons. It's from these last two tribes that we get the term Anglo-Saxon, and it's from the Angles that we get the name England and its eventual language, English. When these Germanic tribes settled in Great Britain, they each settled in different areas of the island, which formed the beginnings of the different dialects of British English that are still around today. Also, when these Germans settled on the island and set up their respective kingdoms, they displaced many of the Celtic-speaking peoples that had been living on the island for centuries. If you remember, the Celtic languages were another one of the Indo-European language groups. Still, these Celtic speakers remained in Great Britain, albeit to the western edges of the island. Even today, these Celtic languages survive as Welsh, Cornish, and Scottish Gaelic. As these Germans lived together on the island, their dialects started to mix, and eventually they formed a new dialect, what we call Old English. It's also possible that the surviving Celtic languages also had an influence on Old English. The Old English period of English lasted from about 500 to 1000 AD. And during this time, it was still a very Germanic language. The epic saga Beowulf is one of the classic examples of Old English. If we try to read Old English, this is what it would look like. This is the Lord's Prayer from the Bible in Old English. As you can see, the spelling and vocabulary look almost nothing like what we call English today. The first line, for example, should be Our Father who is in heaven. But here we see letters we don't use anymore, and if we could study the grammar, it would be much different than the grammar we use today. About halfway through the Old English period, Vikings came from Scandinavia and did what Vikings do: rape, pillage, plunder, and lose football games. But they also settled in parts of Britain and Ireland. When they did, their language started to mix with the Old English that had already started to develop. And because these Vikings were using English as a second language, they started to drastically simplify its grammar. They also added a few hundred of their own words, such as they, their, them, egg, birth, skin, skirt, give, take, call, and die. Some very common words that we use even now. The Old English period basically ended when the French invaded Britain in 1066. More specifically, the Norman French invaded Britain. Ironically, the Normans were also originally Vikings, but they had lived in northern France for long enough that they had adopted French language and culture. When they invaded Britain, they took over government and high society. So Norman French became the prestige language, while English still remained the common spoken language of the people. This marked the beginnings of the Middle English period. The effect was that during this period, about 10,000 words migrated from French into English, mainly related to government, law, education, and culture. However, French doesn't seem to have affected English grammar much during this time. The classic example of Middle English is the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. If we were to look at an example of Middle English, it would look like this. Here again is the Lord's Prayer, but in Middle English. At first, it still looks quite different than modern English, but if we sounded it out, much of it would be intelligible, aside from the odd spellings and some words we don't use anymore. Then, between the years 1400 and 1600, a few things happened that drove English into the period that we call modern English. First, there was a huge shift in pronunciation called the Great Vowel Shift. Second, a couple of milestones in English literature were set: the plays of William Shakespeare and the King James edition of the Bible. Third, it was during this period that the Renaissance spread across Europe. The Great Vowel Shift affected the way most of English was pronounced and explains a lot of the peculiarities we have with spelling and pronunciation today. Shakespeare in the King James Bible provided literary standards for modern English vocabulary, grammar, and style. And the Renaissance brought with it new ideas in art and philosophy, which necessitated importing new words along with the new ideas, specifically from French, Latin, and Greek. If we look at the Lord's Prayer in modern English, that is, early modern English, it sounds a little bit old-fashioned, but it's basically the same English we use today, aside from small changes in vocabulary. So how did English change over its journey from Old English to modern English? First, it lost grammatical gender. That is, nouns were no longer male or female. Second, it lost most of its inflections. Inflections are the endings of words that give us grammatical information. However, we did keep a few inflections, the ed ending and ing ending on verbs, for example, or the plural s ending, or the er or est endings like bigger and biggest, the ly ending on adverbs, and the m ending on some pronouns such as him, them, and whom. These were originally inflections in Old and Middle English, and they used to give us grammatical information, but now we just see them as common endings on words. Also, sentence order became fixed in English. It used to be when there were more inflections on the words that word order was more fluid in the sentence. You could move words around without changing the meaning very much. But since we lost those inflections, that is the grammatical information on the words, we have to put words in a certain order in the sentence. First the subject, then the verb, and then the object. Also, vocabulary diversity grew quite a bit from the Old English period until now. For example, we acquired a lot of vocabulary from Latin, Norse, French, Greek, and other languages. After the beginning of the modern English period, Great Britain became a world power, spreading colonies and English across the globe, in North America, India, and Australia, among many other places. So now we can speak of Englishes in the plural and not just English. Add to this the rapid proliferation of new vocabulary because of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, the independent development of these various English dialects, and now the cross-pollination of these dialects in the age of the internet and globalization. And now we have quite a different language than when we started, with all kinds of quirks and peculiarities. Today, there are about 372 million native speakers of English and over 600 million second language speakers of English. That is, people whose first language is not English, but who live or work in an English-speaking country. Moreover, because English has become the international language of media, business, science, and academics, in total, there are about 1.5 billion language learners in the world. This means that non-native speakers far outnumber native speakers. This also means that the future of English as a global language is going to be driven mostly by the needs and habits of non-native speakers. Throughout its history, much of the change in the English language has been driven by non-native speakers or by the introduction of foreign vocabulary, for example, from the Vikings, the Normans, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and the age of globalization and the internet. In some ways, this has made English easier, for example, in its grammar. In other ways, this has made English more difficult, such as in its vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. And it's these difficulties we will explore in the next video as we look at what specifically makes English challenging to learn for non-native speakers. If you're interested in learning more about the history of English, here are a couple of videos that are very informative and fun to watch. I'll put the links below in the video description. Thanks for watching.